plants over there. So it's a good experience, and they will have a lot more plants pretty soon. Probably, I'd say by mid-March. They're really doing a lot of their stocking up right now. So what I want to do tonight is just review basically pruning woody plants, and then get into how to renovate overgrown shrubs, and a little bit on renovating small trees too, which is not too different than pruning overgrown shrubs. So we're going to go ahead and get into it, if I can get it set up right. Ah,
Okay, I can see your
okay,
screen well. Yeah.
you got it. Okay. Okay, this is what some people are looking for. It really depends on what you want in your landscape, but I call this sort of the ideal landscape because it's a fairly well designed and balanced landscape. You have a good mixture of both deciduous and evergreen plants, and they're pretty well in balance and pretty well maintained. You don't have a lot of shrubs blocking the windows, and the trees are not all over your house. So it's pretty well designed and maintained, which is what a lot of people are hoping to get. But to get that, in a lot of cases, you really need to have a plan. You can't just stick stuff in like a lot of us like to do. I notice a lot of people that come to the nursery where I work that they don't really know what they're looking for a lot of times, and they don't really understand how large the plants are going to get or what kind of space they're going to need to be able to fit those into their landscape, or even sometimes how they're going to look in their landscape. So you need to have a plan. A good plan really helps. So before you get into pruning, you really need to understand something about the plants themselves. Now, most of our plants have what I call a natural form. So if we never pruned it at all, this is the kind of form it would have. It could be oval, it could be spreading, could be weeping, could be pyramidal, or sort of triangular in shape. And those are its natural forms. And if you really want to reduce your pruning and your maintenance, you want to allow them to take their natural form as much as possible. Also, if you want to prune, you really want to prune at the correct time to achieve your desired goal. So we're going to talk a lot about that throughout the program. But if you get too much into heavy summer pruning and we're in a drought period, you're really going to stress the plants out a lot. So you need to consider the time of pruning and what you want to achieve. And think about why you're pruning. You know, what do you want? Are you wanting more fruit? Are you trying to increase your flower? Trying to uplift the plant to give you some clearance underneath? You know, you get a lot of people that are like, well, I took off all the lower limbs off my magnolia so I could mow under there. Well, what are you going to mow under there? Nothing's going to grow under there anyway. So you might as well leave all those lower limbs on so it looks decent and it looks like it has a natural form. So think about what you're trying to achieve before you just get in there and whack away. If you're like my neighbor, he gets himself a new pruning tool and there he goes, away he goes, whether he needs to prune or not. So think about it and make a plan. This is just to give you an idea of what the different forms are. You know, you can get arching or irregular forms or cascading and spreading. A lot of plants have upright forms. Like if you look at some of the hollies in particular, especially the American holly, it takes on almost a nice pyramidal form on its own. So you don't really need to get in there and butcher it and try to make it into a big meatball or a nice square box. Let it take its natural form as much as possible. A lot of plants are rounded or manding or vase shaped. So take a look at your plants and study them a little bit and think about what they're going to look like before you do anything to them. Think about other reasons that you might want to prune. Sometimes it is to maintain that shape. And one I often think about in particular is the little abelias, especially the new dwarf abelias. You know, they have a fairly small rounded form, but every once in a while they shoots up all over the place. So you just need to come in and snip out some of those shoots or get in there and thin out some of those shoots to keep that natural form. You don't have to take your shears and shear the whole plant. You might prune to promote healthier growth. Sometimes you just have some scraggly or poor growth that you can cut out and stimulate the plant to produce better growth. Sometimes the plants are weak or overgrown. And a lot of times that is a result of how we pruned them previously. So some pruning over maybe like some renewal pruning, which might be over a year or two, you could get them back to decent form and good health. Might also remove undesirable growth. And you might also want to remove diseased or damaged or insect sections of the plants. It's much easier just to snip them out sometimes rather than taking your pesticide and treating the whole shrub, where you could just cut out a few leaves or a small section of the plant. You could really cut down on your pesticide use. You could do it to increase flowering, which is done quite often, especially for azaleas and roses and crepe myrtles. It's really time right now to get out there and cut your roses back if you want to get them into a smaller, bushier form and encourage good blooming this summer. Also crepe myrtles, it's a good time to get in there and clean out some of that interior growth and maybe shorten the tops a little bit, but not commit crepe murder. I'm sure all of you know about crepe murder, where you take like a 25-foot or 15-foot Natchez crepe myrtle and whack it down to about 4 or 5 feet. And basically you have a woody stump with a bunch of sprouts coming out. And what you get is very weak growth and a lot of decayed wood underneath because you had to cut them too hard. So you're going to weaken the plants a lot. So we often prune to increase flowering. We might also prune to increase shape or improve the shape. But if you look at the tree on the left, you can see, I don't think you can see the power lines, but basically it was cut back to stay down beneath the power lines. And unfortunately, to keep them beneath the power lines, they're going to have to keep coming back probably on a 1 to 2 year basis at least to keep them down below the lines. So actually the problem here is that we have the wrong plant in the wrong location. We have a plant that's too big for that location. The shrubs on the right, they were just sheared. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's artistic pruning. They like meatballs and little boxes in the landscape, but you can't really even tell what kind of shrubs they are. And when you prune like this, you are increasing your maintenance because every time you shear them, they're going to come and put new growth back out and you're going to have to shear them again. So you're really just increasing your maintenance. And over the long run, you are going to weaken those plants. We'll talk more about shearing as we go on. That's beautiful, isn't it? Looks really nice. The real problem is that they have the wrong plant in the wrong place. It was blocking the sidewalk and also blocking the view from the driveway. So when they're trying to pull out of the driveway, they really can't see where they're going. That's a problem. They probably still can't see where they're going the way it's pruned. It really needs to be a lot smaller shrub, probably a smaller spreading shrub would have been a lot better, or even some nice small perennials or something that would stay small enough not to block your view. So it's really a bad choice of plant material. A lot of times we can prune to remove dead or dying limbs or damaged limbs. One of the main reasons to prune sometimes is to remove branches that are rubbing, because the more they rub on each other, they're opening wounds. And those, anytime you have a wound, that is an entry point for either insects or disease organisms, which can get in and not only destroy the limb, but possibly destroy the whole plant. It just becomes an entry point for other problems. So go ahead and prune out these damaged or broken or rubbing branches. We also prune to remove pest problems or parasitic plants. About the only way that is actually effective to remove mistletoe at this time is to prune it out. And I'm not sure how effective it is, but if you did it correctly and you do it often enough, you probably can limit how much mistletoe you have. But a lot of people don't realize that mistletoe is a parasitic plant. It actually grows down into the tissue of the branches and begins to absorb nutrients and water from those branches and take away from the vigor of the plant. That's why if you see some water oaks in the winter, sometimes you think they're deciduous, but they look evergreen because they have more mistletoe than they have anything else. So removing mistletoe can be done, and pruning it out is going to be the most effective method. There really are no good chemical treatments at this time to limit mistletoe, because if you treat the mistletoe, it's also going to go into the system of the tree and probably also damage the tree. So pruning is a pretty good solution. Not cheap, but a pretty good solution. You can often prune out disease problems. This is called black knot, which is very common on prunus species like your ornamental peaches and ornamental cherries, and a lot on plums also. It's a fungal problem that really cannot be sprayed for control. You have to prune it out. And you can prune it out when it's on the branches like this sample right here in the picture, but it can also get onto your trunk. And when it gets on the trunk, it begins to block the flow of water and nutrients on the trunk of your tree and can eventually cause the death of the top of your tree. So it's a pretty deadly disease on fruit tree species. You really need to prune it out when you see it. Can also use pruning to remove some of the common pest problems. The one on the left are bagworms, much more common on evergreen species like your cedars and your junipers and your cypress. The funniest thing I've ever heard of anybody though is they actually pruned out all the bags and threw them on the ground at the base of the plant. But what they didn't understand was the bags are full of like the female caterpillar. So the only thing that happened was caterpillar went back up into the tree because you didn't actually destroy the bags. The one on the right are spring tent caterpillars, and they really don't kill trees, but they can pretty much defoliate trees in the spring, especially again, fruit tree species like your cherries, and they do a pretty good job even on cherry laurels actually. But the most effective way would be to maybe take a stick, knock that nest out of there, or if you can reach it, possibly prune it out. And then the one on the bottom are supposedly fall webworms, which for some reason seem to be getting more and more into midsummer webworms. Not sure why it is, but maybe it's because summers are getting longer and warmer. So they, again, can be pruned out too, because they are usually at the ends of the branches, and you'll find them in trees like sweet gums, if anybody cares about sweet gums. Also sourwoods, pecans, hickories. So you'll see them in a variety of trees, but usually at the ends of the branches. So they can be knocked out or pruned out in many cases. If you really like to prune, then I would say you should play around with some formal pruning like your topiary or your espalier or pollarding, or grow yourself a nice formal hedge. And you can do some pruning, because every time you prune it, like I said earlier, you are stimulating new growth. You're not really controlling growth, you're stimulating new growth. And when you prune and prune heavily, you're also going to increase the water use of the plant, and you're also going to increase the need for fertilizer, because you're putting so much stress on that plant and you're really telling it to grow faster. So it's going to need more water and more fertilizer. So it's not a good use of resources, but a lot of people do like formal styles. So how to prune? Keep in mind the 3 T's. The 3 T's are tools, timing, and technique. So when we say tools, we're talking about the right tools for the pruning job you're going to be doing. We'll talk more about the tools as we go along. Timing is important, mostly because you want to keep the growth requirements of that plant in mind. If you're going to be doing some light pruning, you can pretty much do that all summer long, depending on the type of plant. If you're going to be doing like rejuvenating or reducing the size of overgrown shrubs, a lot of times you want to do that early before their new growth, because that's when they have the nutrients and stored food available to push out the new growth. So you have to keep the timing in mind. Technique, we're going to talk more about that, but basically that's where you make your cuts and how you direct the new growth in the direction you want. Because keep in mind, where the bud goes and which direction that bud is going is the direction that the plant is going to grow after you make your cut. After you remove the top buds, which are the dominant buds, the side buds are going to come out below and thicken up the plant so you can direct that growth. That's part of your technique. And making good cuts is part of your technique. Oh, another trick to tools, not only to have the right tools, but also to maintain those tools correctly. Anybody that has used the old rusty saw or old rusty dull pruning tools that they used to pull out nails or that they cut wire with, you'll know that you cannot make effective cuts on plants after you damage the tools like that. So you may need to maintain your tools correctly. Keep them sharp. So like we said, use the proper tool for each task. Consider making thinning cuts instead of shearing cuts whenever you can, because shearing over the long haul is going to weaken your plants. Use the right techniques and prune them at the appropriate time. We will talk more about the timing as we go into more specific pruning. These are some of the tools. I'm sorry the slide is not that great, but it will give you an idea of what the tools are that you'll be using. The top one are loppers, and loppers can take some muscle if you're going to be doing a lot of lopping, because it's used to make some of the bigger cuts, usually up to about 1.5 inch cut. And there are some ratchet loppers that can be a little bit easier to use. So make sure you get some good loppers and keep them pruned, keep them sharp, I'm sorry. The next one down on the left are hand pruners. That's a scissor type. And we will talk more about the hand pruners. The saw on the right is just a regular tree saw. If you think about tree saws, though, their teeth are a little bit different than the saws you would use like in your wood shop. A tree saw has teeth in both directions so that you can cut in both directions in the forward push and also the pull back. So you're making a much more rapid cut and usually a nice clean cut if it's sharp. And they can get dull too. And as I found out last year, they are not that easy to get sharpened anywhere. Really no one does sharpening of those kind of blades, and you almost need to buy yourself a new blade if it gets too dull. Next tool down are the shears, two-handled shears. And in many cases, we would just assume you lose your shears unless you're going to use them to prune like liriope. They are very effective on liriope if you got to get down to the ground and snip your liriope off before the new growth comes in. Next tool down is a bow saw, and it again is used for making larger cuts and sometimes is more effective in some tight locations on trees or shrubs. And the final one again is another hand saw, tree saw. Those are for bigger cuts, often as large as 2 to 3 inches in diameter. So you can make good sized cuts with those. And if you're very like if you're into making hand saw cuts, you can even take down small trees. I've cut down as large as a 5 to 6 inch tree with a hand saw. Made me feel very macho too. So again, hand saws and chainsaws are for bigger cuts. But if you're going to use a chainsaw, you need to be very cautious and you need to know what you're doing and how to manage the saw. It would be much wiser for homeowners to hire a professional to do chainsaw work. Much safer also, because you can easily get hurt using a chainsaw. Loppers are excellent tools for some of the bigger cuts. Hand pruners, you have the anvil or the scissor type. I have a picture, I think, coming up so you can see which is which. But they are for your fine pruning down to 3/4 inch in size. So it's for fine cuts. Again, they need to be kept sharp. And shears are for your formal hedges. These are your small hand pruners. The anvil type is on the left. I'm not really excited about using anvil pruners because they get dull very rapidly and they tend to pull and tear in many cases rather than making a clean cut. And if you think about it, whenever you tear the bark and it's not cut cleanly, you don't get a good closure of those wounds. So you often are left with open wounds that are, again, open entry points for disease or pest problems. So I would prefer you use a hand pruner such as the one on the right, which is referred to as the scissor type. It tends to make a much cleaner cut and it is much easier to keep sharp also. But buy you a good one. More and more people prefer to use one like a Felco, which is a little bit more expensive pruner, but it tends to hold its sharpening better and has good durability as far as lasting well, and is pretty easy to repair also if you have to replace parts on it. These are for reaching up into large shrubs or even small trees. I would not really recommend you use them up on a step ladder though, because a lot of times step ladders are not very well balanced. The power one I wouldn't use on a step ladder at all. The hand one you could use on a small step ladder, but they allow you to reach up into the plants and either cut off small branches or snip them off, because it also has a pruning end. Doesn't look like it, but that is the pruning end, and then there's a cutting end. So you can snip them off or you can saw them off. Okay. This is an important part because we're going to discuss heading, which really is shearing, or if you're doing tree work, it would be pretty much the same as topping your tree, because you get the same basic results. You cut them basically around the same level, and you are encouraging all that new growth at the outer tips of the branches. So you get a rapid new growth, very dense new growth, and that blocks the light into the central part of the plant, and you begin to get a thinning out of the central plant. So you're going to end up with a not very vigorous plant. And if that new growth got any kind of disease or pest problem, then you're going to end up with big holes in the plant, not very attractive. So to get a better, healthier plant, you really need to think about thinning. And what you're going to do there is get into the inside of the plant. And a lot of times you're taking some main branches out or main shoots out all the way down into the plant so that you can get light all the way inside. And if you get good light and good airflow, you're going to have good, healthy growth, even down in the central part of the plant, which is what you want. This is our friend Bill, who knows nothing about pruning. And he bought this house, which had a lot of what I would call pretty much overgrown or wild looking plants. So what do you think Bill is going to do? Is he going to go ask his local extension agent how he should prune these things? Or is he going to get online? Nah, Bill's an old fashioned guy. He's not into that online stuff. He's going to go next door and speak to Harold, because, Harold's a veteran gardener. He knows everything about gardening. He's been gardening his whole life, and I'm sure Harold's been doing it correctly. Harold's going to get in there and prune all his shrubs with his shears, cut them all at the same height. I know about that because that's what my dad would do. He would stand in the middle of all the shrubs and just cut them all off at the same height, because he didn't care what kind of shrub they were. He just wanted them to look clean, and they would look clean for 2 or 3 weeks until they would take off again. So Harold's our local expert on pruning. So he gives them the crew cut job. You just cut them straight across. But this is what shearing does again, so that y'all will think about what happens when you shear plants. If you shear them like it is on the left there, the right side is the growth response you get from the shearing. So like I said earlier, all your new growth is out at the tips of the branches. You're going to get all that nice, new, dense, healthy growth at the tips and nothing down underneath. So if anything else happens to that plant, it gets stressed or diseased or get pest problems, you're going to end up with big holes or possibly even a dead plant. So shearing is not the way to go. Anybody have older shrubs like these? That happens a lot. When you shear plants and you shear them so they are wider at the top and narrow at the bottom, you're really shading out the bottom of the plants so that you no longer have an effective screen anymore. The bottom of the plants are opening up, and it's just not going to be an effective screen. So you're going to have to get in there and renovate it. And depending on what type of plants and their vigor, that's going to tell you when you can renovate. So again, timing would be important on that. For example, if those were like lovely old privets, how about that? I'm sure everybody has some privets. You know, we can butcher the heck out of privets, and we often do. And they often will thin out at the base because we never prune them correctly. The best way to prune them actually is to the ground and then treat them with the herbicide, by the way. But if you prune them incorrectly and prune them wider at the top, they shade out the bottom of the plants and they're not going to look halfway decent or even any decent at all, but they're privets, so that's okay. So what we should be doing again is thinning. This is what we started with in the middle, and a little thinning on the left is what we want to do. And again, we're looking at opening up the middle of the plant, and keep in mind the idea again is to get light and air into the middle of the plant, which will allow new growth to be available all the way down into that plant. The one on the right is just pruned so that it's narrower because it was near the side of a house or possibly near a driveway or a sidewalk. But again, you are thinning and you are also bringing in the sides to reduce the side growth. Oh, Bill's back. Bill's been doing some reading and talking to his local extension agent. So now he's pretty sure he has the right idea on this pruning technique. He decided that Harold didn't really know what he was talking about. I can give you another good example of a person that was gardening like that. We had a guy come in the office once who said he had been liming around his vegetable garden every year for the past 30 years. And he had never soil tested, so he had no idea what his pH was, but he had gotten the pH up to 8.0, which if you all know anything about pH, for an effective, healthy vegetable garden, you really want a slightly acid pH, usually like 5.5 to maybe 6.0, 6.2, but certainly not 8.0. So he got to the point where nothing was growing anymore, but he finally did admit that he had been liming every year and heavily, and finally began to understand what he had done to the soil. So keep in mind, again, the cuts and the technique. You can see that he is cutting pretty close to that bud, and I have a pretty good picture of it coming up, so you can see how close to the bud or side shoot you want to make your cuts. But you want to make a nice clean cut, and you want to make it on a slight slant, and again, you want to direct your growth, usually away from the center of the plant, more towards the outer edges of the plant. So this is what Bill ended up with this time. He did a good job of thinning, and you can see he opened up the plant, and he'll get a lot more sun and air into that central part of the plant, which will result in much thicker, healthier growth. And this is what he ended up with, which is a pretty good natural looking shrub. And if you still don't like this form, you can still get in there and do some thinning and touching up. But again, keep in mind the natural form that you are trying to achieve. So these are thinning cuts again. The plant was very thick. The one on the left is the original plant. and the one on the right is what it will look like after you do your thinning operation. So you're actually getting in and taking out some of the main leaders or main limbs in the central part of the plant, and then you are removing a lot of the smaller growth to open up that central part, get more light in there.
Gary, this is Yanni. It's
Yes.
6:40 now. We have 20 minutes left.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So you can also do this once your plants get to the right height that you would like to maintain. But again, the one on the right is your finished product. You actually remove some of the central leaders to make sure you get a good airflow and good light flow through that central part of the plant. Keep in mind also some trees, especially like dogwoods, have been grafted. So if you don't keep those sprouts coming up from below the graft, you could end up with a dogwood that has not only pink or not only the red petals or red blooms, but you could also get white blooms coming back up because those special cultivars are often grafted onto a rootstock of the white, which is the native, much hardier variety. So if you don't keep those sprouts from coming up below the graft, you're going to end up with a dogwood that is probably multicolored, which you might like and you might not like. So this is just pruning for tight spaces. And again, you have opened up the central part of the plant, but you have reduced the side growth back to either side branches or side buds to keep a much narrower plant that will fit in the space you have available. Never leave branch stubs like that because that is an entry point for decay. You want to actually prune it back to what we call the branch collar, which actually is part of the trunk. The branch actually sits in a collar, which is part of the trunk. And if you prune down into that collar, then you are actually wounding the tree or shrub, and it's never going to close very well. So it becomes an entry point for disease. These are the angles and how close to the buds you should get. A is the correct pruning method. You're not making such a drastic slant and you are slightly above the bud. If you look at B, you have gotten too close to that bud and that bud probably is going to be damaged and dry out. So you're going to end up with a dead branch tip. C, again, is too far away from the bud. So you're going to end up with a dead tip there. And D, again, is too close to the bud. So it is important that you prune at the correct angle and at the correct distance from the bud, which you will get used to once you begin pruning correctly. When you prune is based on what? This is pretty general rules. Not sure all plants have memorized these rules yet. So keep in mind that all plants don't stick to these. But basically, some of the spring flowering plants should be pruned after they bloom. That would be in particular ones like your azaleas. They are best pruned probably by May, maybe June. If you prune them too late in the season, they already have set buds for next year, and you're going to cut out next year's flower buds. So one of those that should be pruned later in the summer is the azaleas. Summer flowering plants should be pruned before their growth. Good example of that one would be crepe myrtles. They really should be pruned at this time of year, but not over pruned. So again, spring flowering, you prune before they bloom. Summer flowering should be pruned after they bloom. This is just some of the spring flowering plants that are very common. One of the most difficult plants to prune now probably would be the hydrangeas, and that's because there are so many different hydrangeas now that you need to keep in mind what type of hydrangea. You know, we have the reblooming hydrangeas now that if you want to keep them reblooming, you have to keep pruning out the dead flowers. Can't leave those dead flower heads on there. And they will pretty much bloom into probably early to late fall and maybe even up to frost. So keep them pruned. These are some of the summer flowering plants that we commonly prune: abelias, golden rain, rosa Sharon, nandinas, shrub roses, sweet shrubs. Summer flowering like the crepe myrtles, again, keep in mind the size and shape you are looking for, and consider doing thinning operations. And if you get a crepe myrtle that's too large, rather than butchering it, maybe consider taking it out and putting in one that is more appropriate for that location, because you can get crepe myrtles in many sizes now, including petites that get like probably 2 to 3 feet tall or so. So get the appropriate ones for your location. This is what happens when you prune them incorrectly. You get all the new growth at the tips. And as you go later into the year, that growth gets very heavy with the blooms and is very susceptible to breakage. So you often get them breaking out and you get a lot of very weak growth. This is how they should be pruned correctly, which is the thinning operation, and that should be done at this time of year. Another problem with over pruning, especially crepe myrtles, is that you stress them so much. They are very open to a pest problem called the Asian ambrosia beetles, which can get into the trunks of them and can kill them rapidly. So if you stress and weaken them too much, they can attract the Asian ambrosia beetles and they can be killed off. Evergreens, especially the narrow leaf evergreens, we'd be talking about junipers, arborvitaes, cypress, cedars, chamaecyparis. All of them should only be pruned back into their live green growth. If you prune back hard into the older wood, you're going to end up with dead sections of the plant because they don't have dormant buds under their bark like a lot of the broadleaf evergreens do, like your hollies and your osmanthus and a lot of those broadleaf evergreens. If you cut them hard, they will regenerate from the older wood. So one of the biggest problems with our narrowleaf evergreens is that we don't keep in mind the spacing, and we often don't keep in mind their eventual size. I know in my own property, they put in the, I think it was blue Pacific junipers, and all the landscape design sections I ever read said to space them as much as 6 feet apart. And a lot of times they were put in 1 to 2 foot centers. So what's going to happen? They're going to grow over the top of each other. You're going to have very weak growth, and it's going to stay very wet and eventually rot out or get disease. So spacing is a big thing with these evergreens. They cannot be severely pruned back into the old wood. I throw boxwoods in here because they really don't respond that well to hard pruning. In the past, it was often recommended, but if you value your boxwoods, I would recommend you prune them back gradually to get them back to a size that you would like to have them, maybe over a 1 to 2 year period to rejuvenate them. This is what will happen. You get a dead zone, which is especially prevalent on junipers. I've seen many junipers that were in wrong locations, and people decide they're going to reduce the size, and they cut them back to like woody stumps, and guess what you end up with? Woody stumps, no new growth. So they can't be pruned like that. Use the correct shrubs and put them in the right locations. And if you have to, prune them back every year, but only into the green section of the new growth. This is pretty much my shrubs growing over the top of each other and rotting each other out. So they were incorrectly planted and the spacing was incorrect. All of these evergreens can be pretty much cut back each year, but they should be cut back again into that green growth. That's why it's such a problem when leylands get the canker disease, because the cankers kill branches or sections of the leylands. Leylands are not going to recover in those sections, and you're going to end up with big holes in the plants. Not attractive. So rejuvenation pruning, especially on weakened plants, should be done over a 1 to 2 year period. The first year you would get in there and thin out and remove some of those main trunks and do a little branching of the side shoots. The second year you get in there and remove those trunks that you didn't previously remove. So by the end of the second year, you have cut out all that older growth and you have regained a suitable size as well as opened up the plant, but it's done gradually. That's mostly for plants that are not that healthy. This is how it should look. The one on the left shows you the gradual removal of some of those leaders and the removal of those side shoots and the opening up of the center of the plant. So you do it over really a 1 to 2 year period. If you have healthier plants like some big old hollies or large osmanthus or what else? Maybe waxleaf ligustrums that were often put in the wrong places and they were allowed to get too large. And they're healthy plants. You can come in and cut them drastically. Yeah, very drastically. In fact, you're basically cutting them down to a 12 to 18-inch woody stump. And that should be done in about mid-Feb to mid-March. And if you read up on it, it says to do it so many weeks before new growth, because that way you're utilizing the plant's stored food and it's going to go ahead and push out that new growth. It's not going to be rapid though. It's going to take probably a good 4 to 6 weeks or more to really put out new growth. So this is drastic, but sometimes it's worth it to salvage the plant and not have to dig it out and install a new plant. This is what you'll get eventually, and you can begin to thin that more and reshape the plant. And you're not giving up a shrub that you might have already invested 10 or 15 years in the plant. So it's definitely worth a try. If you don't like that technique, then you might also consider pruning them into a tree form and uplifting them and still keeping that plant. But that again depends on the location and the effect you're trying to get in your landscape. If you have the right location for it, then it could easily be pruned up into a tree form. And to prune it this heavily, probably again should be done this time of year, mid-February to mid-March, because you are going to remove approximately 50% of its growth, probably. And this is just, again, rejuvenation of a hedge. And you can see what happened. The top is much wider than the bottom, and it shaded out the bottom of the plant, so it's no longer an effective hedge. So to regain your hedge appearance, you're going to have to begin to take down that height and get the shrub to thicken up, probably over a 1 to 2 year period. So another thing to keep in mind in hedges is that you don't want to prune the sides straight up and down. And why is that? It's because of the light condition that we already discussed. If you prune it straight up and down like a box, then you're not getting good light down at the bottom of the plant, and that's going to begin to thin out the bottom of the plant, which again would not make for an attractive or effective hedge. So you want to trim hedges so that they are wider at the base, and from a side view, it would be much more of a triangle or pyramidal pruning appearance. And that way, as you can see, you kept the healthy growth all the way to the bottom of the plant, and you still have an effective screen and attractive, healthier plants. So I want to thank the university for the use of their slide set. I did do a few minor tweaking changes, but I often use their materials and I appreciate their helpful attitude. They're always very good about sharing materials. And just a little plug for Randy's Nursery. If you haven't been there, it is a good family nursery, and they are pretty much known for their wide selection of plant materials, both woodies and perennials, as well as a good selection of annuals. And they also are a pretty big supplier of palm trees, if you're interested in trying some palms. And they have very good people that work with their water gardens, and they carry a wide variety of fish, and they even will install ponds if you're interested in getting a pond installed. So thank you all for your attendance tonight, and if there are more questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Gary.
Quite welcome, anytime.
So I think we have a general question because some of our participants is coming from different region of the nation. Okay. And it's hard for them to give them a uniform standard. They should prune their plants like early February or like early March. So yeah. Can you kind of like give them a standard for people in different area to determine when they should prune their plants?
Yeah, in a case like that, I would say it is most effective for them to prune about 4 to 6 weeks before new growth. So like I know up in New York, a lot of new growth on plants probably is not going to be till May or June. So to do some rejuvenation pruning is going to be later in the year in that section of the country. So it would be based more on your weather conditions where you live and when the new growth starts on your plant materials.
Okay. So if you have any questions, you are welcome to type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions as well. I think I can like answer them once you gave your talk. Yeah, so some people said they want to visit your nursery. And there's one. Over. Yeah, there's one participant ask about the slides. So I record this presentation and I will send y'all a review email tomorrow with the record of this presentation. So yeah.
I have a question. When do you prune your blueberries?
Blueberries should be pruned in February to early March. Usually they're not pruned heavily though. It's much more of a thinning operation. You would get inside and remove some of the older stems and open up the plants a little.
Even though they have already started blooming? Budding?
Oh, well, yeah. They're blooming pretty early because of the weather conditions, but yes. Yeah, if it's too thick, you really want to open it up because they're not going to do well if they are too thick, and your production is going to be limited by the amount of light you get in the middle of the plant anyway. So it wouldn't hurt to remove a few shoots from the middle of the plant.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
So the next question is, what do you think about using a saw or with a pruning blade?
I didn't understand what you mean.
Okay, so that's kind of like how the question comes.
Okay.
What do you
Pruning,
think about using a saw? Always pruning blade.
It's a, Gary, it's a sawzall. You know, they,
oh, a
Sawzall.
sawzall.
yeah. How
Uh,
do you recommend a sawzall with the new pruning blades?
That's a good question. I've never used a sawzall,
Well,
actually.
honey, you need to buy yourself one. They're awesome.
They're very, I heard they were very handy tools, actually.
Yeah, but you have to use a pruning blade, but I love it, you know, with arthritis in your hands. It
Yeah.
makes a
Are
much
they,
easier pruning.
can you get them, are they battery operated or you have to
Yes.
use electrical?
No, you can get battery operated ones and you can get lightweight ones
Okay.
that aren't as heavy as some of the big ones that people use for construction.
Where would you get one? Online or?
Online or Home Depot or
Okay.
Lowe's.
That's
Wherever.
definitely worth looking into. I will check that out, Nancy Beckermeyer.
Okie doke.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
Gary,
if it-
another question about the black gum tree.
Uh-huh.
So how can you touch more details on how to prune that plant?
Pruning black gums. I'm not sure why you would want to prune it unless you have dead wood or you want to uplift the tree, or I don't know what they're trying to achieve. It depends on what you want to achieve. But usually if you have enough room for a black gum, you shouldn't have to prune it much at all, other than sometimes you'll remove lower limbs or some dead wood on it. So it really depends on what you're interested in trying to achieve.
Okay, and I think there is another participant asking about pruning crepe myrtle. Can you touch some details on that?
Okay. Pruning crepe myrtle should be done this time of year. One of the biggest things you're going to have to do on crepe myrtles a lot of times is clean out the middle of the plant, and sometimes also remove suckers down at the base. They tend to sucker a lot at the lower base of the trees and often on the lower parts of the root zone area. So you would want to just prune that out. And a lot of times you also would need to thin out some of the center of the plant because they tend to get a lot of dead stuff inside. I often just take my gloves and rub it up and down the stems to clean off that older dead stuff. It breaks out quite easily, and I don't touch the top of it at all because I want mine in a tree form anyway. But it should be primarily cleaned out this time of year.
Okay, and what are your favorite native woodies?
Native, which?
Woody
Oh,
plants.
my favorite native woodies. Good question. Well, I love oak leaf hydrangeas, but I've never grown them very well. I usually manage to kill them somehow. Everybody tells me how easy they are to grow, but for some reason, I usually manage to rot them. I don't think I get them in the right locations. They prefer like the edge of a wooded area, and I think I don't take the time to plant them very well, but I love oak leaf hydrangeas. I love the PG hydrangeas, which are the later summer blooming ones. There are really some great PG hydrangeas out now that can get 6 to 8 feet and take full sun. Very attractive plants, great blooms. Also, I wish I could grow some rhododendrons, but never done very well with those in the Atlanta area either. I guess I don't take the time to plant them correctly. And native azaleas. I have a lot of native azaleas. I've done very well with this. Any other questions?
Yes. So when do you prune queens? Quince.
Quince,
I think that is right after their their flower,
Yes.
right?
yeah, yes, because they're gonna be, well, they're starting to bloom right now, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Probably.
and they would look much better if you do some thinning on them too. They tend to get really wild looking and sprout all over the place. So they would tend to look better if you did a little thinning and opening them up a little bit. But yes, you're right. They should be done after flowering.
What
Yeah.
about
So
knockout
next,
roses?
Knockouts, they should be pretty much pruned all summer long, because if you don't, you're going to reduce your amount of bloom. And if you want to get them to a decent size, this would be the time to cut them down to shorter stems. You can cut them as low as 12 to 18 inches. And then when you get your bloom and the bloom fades, go ahead and cut the bloom out, and they will bloom pretty much up to frost. But you will need to keep fertilizing them also. To grow roses well, you really want to give them pretty much a monthly application of fertilizer, and that would be almost March through probably July, August, so that they can keep pushing out the new blooms.
Thank you.
Sure.
okay. So next question: would you prune a dwarf fig tree? If so, when?
A dwarf fig tree. I've never seen a dwarf fig tree. If you wanted to prune a fig, though, now is the time to do it.
Hmm.
And normally, the figs you prune, if you don't prune them, they become trees, and you're not going to get the figs. So you really want to prune them down and keep them to at least a good 5 to 6 foot height, to where you can harvest the figs and not give them away to all the birds.
Hmm.
And they produce best on their new growth anyway.
Okay. So the next question is about gardenia. When do you prune gardenia, and do you thin a gardenia?
Gardenias, there's some really new ones that are excellent plants. Like one of them is, I forget the name of it. It's something frost, but the newer gardenias are much better plants and much more resistant to whiteflies. But if you want to prune gardenias, that usually should be done after bloom. And so in most cases, that would be June, July, because after that, they're going to start setting new buds for next year by fall. The old timey gardenias anyway. So pretty much after bloom would be the time for those.
Okay, so just do the thinning cut.
Yeah.
Okay.
But,
So the next
but
question is about dogwood. Is a volunteer dogwood worth tending?
yes and no. Because I have several volunteer dogwoods, but they have not bloomed very well. So it depends. If you get it up to a suitable size and it gets a decent bloom, then it's worth keeping. But a lot of the ones that come up in the wild are not really good bloomers. So you might be better off investing your time and money in a better hybrid plant. And we have some really nice dwarf dogwoods at Randy's nursery that will only get about 8 to 10 feet and have beautiful flower buds on them already. We also have a Chinese evergreen dogwood. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that one, but it stays green all winter. And it's quite an attractive plant, and it has really nice white blooms in the spring, but it is a evergreen.
Okay, that's all the questions in the chat box.
Okay, very good. Well, I
So
appreciate everybody coming and being with us tonight, and enjoyed
do we have
talking to you.
last minute question before? Okay, I think we don't have. So like the decab extension, we have our annual plant sale coming up like now until April. I will give you a link in the review email. So if you want to go over the plant list or if you want to order something, you will find it in that review email I send out. I will send out tomorrow.
Is that also on your website?
Yeah, it is also on our UGA decab extension website. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you everybody to hanging out here with us tonight. Hope you have a good night. Bye.
Well, thank you.